Wilhelmina Sorensen Krantz inherited her great-grandmother's farm journals along with the farm itself, 3 cracked leather notebooks filled with a century-old hand that recorded, in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for weather and prices, a long list of small practices that read, to modern eyes, like superstition dressed up as agriculture. Planting certain crops by moon phase, burying fish scraps beneath fruit tree roots, rotating specific companion plantings that had nothing to do with any nitrogen-fixing logic a modern extension bulletin would recognize, and dozens of smaller habits scattered across 60 years of entries that nobody in the family had taken seriously in at least 2 generations. "You're going to plant by the moon now," said her uncle Torvald, who'd farmed the same 80 acres for 30 years, using exactly the methods every other row crop operation in the county used, and who regarded his late mother's journals as a charming but thoroughly outdated curiosity. "That's not farming, Mina. That's your great-grandmother keeping herself entertained during a hard winter." "Maybe," Wilhelmina said, "or maybe she wrote down what actually worked for her, in language modern enough that nobody's bothered translating it since. She didn't set out, at first, to prove anything either way. She'd inherited the 80 acres mostly by circumstance rather than any long farming ambition of her own, having spent the previous decade working as a research assistant in a university soil science lab before family circumstances pulled her back to take over the property nobody else in the family particularly wanted. What she brought to her great-grandmother's journals, unlike Torvald, was a professional habit of testing a claim properly before dismissing it, and a mild academic curiosity about how many of these century-old habits might turn out to have a real mechanism behind them once someone bothered to look, rather than simply writing the whole collection off as folk superstition. She picked 6 practices from the journals that first year, choosing the ones specific and repeatable enough to actually test against a control, and set up small side-by-side plots across her land. A section planted, according to her great-grandmother's noted moon phase timing, beside an identical section planted on a conventional calendar schedule, a row of tomatoes grown over buried fish scraps beside an identical row grown in ordinary amended soil, and so on through the rest of her selected list, tracked carefully across the season, with the same rigor she'd once applied to actual research work. "You're wasting a growing season, proving your great-grandmother wasn't a witch," Torvald said, more than once that summer, watching her walk the paired plots with a clipboard and a level of attention he considered considerably more effort than the results were likely to deserve. Most of the 6 practices, when the season's results came in, showed no meaningful difference at all, exactly the outcome Torvald had predicted, and exactly the outcome Wilhelmina herself had expected for at least some of them, since she hadn't gone into the experiment assuming her great-grandmother's journals were secretly a hidden trove of forgotten agricultural genius. But 2 of the 6 practices produced differences too consistent to dismiss as noise, and it was in tracking down why that Wilhelmina found herself, by the following winter, deep into research that took her considerably further than she'd originally planned to go. The buried fish scraps beneath her tomato row had produced noticeably more vigorous plants, and a modestly larger yield than the conventionally amended control row, a result that made immediate sense once she actually researched it rather than dismissing it as folk practice. Fish scraps decomposing slowly in the root zone released nitrogen, phosphorus, and a range of trace minerals gradually over the growing season, functioning as a slow-release fertilizer in an era before her great-grandmother would have had any commercial equivalent available, and doing so in a way that, as it turned out, modern organic growers had independently rediscovered and marketed as fish emulsion fertilizer, sold at a real premium at garden centers for exactly the same underlying mechanism her great-grandmother had simply been doing by hand with kitchen scraps. The moon phase planting result took longer to explain, and Wilhelmina remained genuinely uncertain, even after considerable reading, whether the lunar timing itself mattered at all, or whether it was simply a convenient, memorable proxy for something else her great-grandmother's generation had noticed without having the scientific vocabulary to describe directly. The specific planting windows recorded in the journals, when Wilhelmina cross-referenced them against decades of regional weather records, correlated suspiciously well with historically reliable stretches of stable soil temperature and moisture in her particular microregion, patterns that repeated with enough regularity, tied to seasonal weather cycles rather than the moon's gravitational influence, that a farmer without access to soil thermometers or long-range forecasts might reasonably have anchored their planting calendar to the one visible, easily tracked cycle that happened to correlate closely enough to be useful. "It's not magic," she told Torvald that winter, going through her research notes at his own kitchen table while he remained determinedly unconvinced. "It's probably just accumulated observation, dressed up in language that made sense to someone without our instruments." She didn't need to know why the timing worked. She just needed to notice that it did, often enough to write it down as a rule. Word about Wilhelmina's experiment moved through the county slowly that first year, mostly as a mildly amusing story about a young woman testing her dead great-grandmother's superstitions instead of farming properly, the kind of story that got repeated at the co-op counter with the same gentle condescension Torvald himself had offered from the start. But by her second season, once she'd begun deliberately incorporating the fish scrap fertilizing technique across a larger section of her tomato and pepper crops, and started seeing consistent, measurable results at a scale too large to attribute to a lucky first-year plot, the story shifted from amusing curiosity to something a few of her more practical neighbors started asking about directly. "You're telling me burying fish guts actually does something," said Coretta Ashworth, who ran a small specialty vegetable operation 2 farms over and had, like Torvald, initially treated Wilhelmina's project as a pleasant eccentricity rather than something worth adopting herself. "That's not just an old story. It's an old story that happens to be describing real chemistry," Wilhelmina said. She didn't call it slow-release nitrogen. She called it feeding the roots something rich. Same thing, different vocabulary. By her third year, Wilhelmina had turned the whole project into something closer to a standing local resource than a personal curiosity, working her way slowly through the rest of her great-grandmother's journals with the same careful testing method, discarding practices that didn't hold up to scrutiny, and documenting, in detail, the handful that did. She started fielding occasional questions from neighbors, curious whether their own family's old, half-remembered farming habits might be worth testing the same way, and helped 2 of them set up their own small side-by-side comparison plots the following spring, using the same patient methodology she'd first applied somewhat defensively, mostly to prove a point to her own skeptical uncle. Torvald never did fully come around to the moon phase planting, remaining privately convinced that Wilhelmina's weather correlation explanation was likely closer to the truth than any actual lunar influence, but he adopted the fish scrap fertilizing technique himself by her 4th year on a section of his own 80 acres, with results consistent enough that he stopped making jokes about witches sometime around the 2nd season. "People still ask what else is in those journals," Wilhelmina said, years later, the 3 cracked leather notebooks sitting on a shelf in what had become a small but genuine home reference library on regional soil and climate history. "I tell them most of it probably won't hold up, but every so often something does, and I'd rather find out which parts by testing them properly than by assuming a woman who farmed this same ground for 60 years had nothing left worth learning from."